Okay, well, in this edition of the Hidden Warrior podcast, we've got something a bit special in that we're here with Ian Lawrence, and we're here to uncover something about the secret history. And the secret history we're doing today is about the Magdalen Laundries that were in Ireland. And the thought that I had was that there are certain things that happen in life if you're lucky enough to live a long life, Ian.
Yes, that's indeed true, yes.
And especially with yourself having been born in 1934. And you can look back and sort of think that there were certain things that were of genuine historical interest. And as we go through the course of history, those things become a lot clearer. Obviously, there's World War II that you remember as a child.
Yes, indeed, yes.
But that's probably quite well known. But there's something that I thought about that's from your history and an involvement you had, a really remarkable involvement that you had. And that's in the Magdalen Laundries of Ireland, something which has become only to sort of public understanding and prominence more recently. But there's still some secretive things about that whole episode, which you had a direct involvement, which I'm sure nobody would ever know anything about without you being here to sort of materially witness it, as it were. But first of all, I'd just like to explain what were the Magdalen Laundries?
Well, as far as anybody at that time was concerned, we knew really very little about them at all. In Ireland, there was a good deal of problem with them because the Catholic Church had been very dominant in the way that it dealt with social problems. And one of their worst social problems was women having children out of wedlock, which was very much against their church teaching and so on. But we knew very little more than that, for instance, in the town where I'm going to be talking about, in the town of Wexford, there were 70 religious organisations actually functioning in that one city, which is astonishing, really, of which 3 of them were, as I later found out, were called Magdalen Laundries. But as far as we were concerned, and the people that I worked with, they were just places where a lot of nuns stood on boxes and told the girls, who were slave labour basically, to do what they wanted.
Yeah. So the girls who had children outside of wedlock, and the girls who were prostitutes, I suppose, were they sort of compelled to go in the laundries by sort of social pressure, or?
Yes, remembering again the strength of the Roman Church at that particular time, they were forced to disappear, really, and many people used to disappear out of the normal social life because of so-called sins that they had acquired during their lifetimes, whether it was through children out of wedlock or it was prostitution or something of that sort. But the Roman Church thought the best thing to do was to make them invisible. And so they put them into organisations, and of course anything to do with women, there were always plenty of nuns to look after them, who in their own way, of course, had their own problems.
Yeah. In some ways, because they were taken out of society as well, the nuns, weren't they?
Absolutely. In fact, we used to think that the nuns and the victims were 2 sides of the same coin.
Yeah. What happened to the children? Presumably the children were put into state-run homes as well, were they? Were they taken off the women who went into the laundries?
No, I mean, when they were old enough, of course, they started in the laundries.
Yeah.
So they were used and rudimentarily educated, really for domestic work, which of course was getting much less by the time that the Second World War ended, when really that was the end of domestic labour throughout the whole of Europe,
Yeah.
never mind Ireland, although Ireland was a little bit behind in terms of domestic service. It was still possible to hire servants from Ireland at that time.
Just to sort of put this in historical time and place, at the time of your involvement, was this, what sort of decade of the 20th century was this?
Yes, my involvement was in the 1960s.
And, I mean, forgive my ignorance on this, but was that a time when most people didn't have, for example, their own laundry machines, their own washing machines still?
No, the only thing was there was a difference between the development of England, for example, and the Republic of Ireland. The Republic of Ireland had a much greater use of laundrettes, which were just coming in at that particular time, because people couldn't afford to have their own machines. And of course the laundries for which I worked were in a very big way a business. I mean, typically, for example, the vans would go out, usually electrical vans, like the old milk floats, and they would have 3 boys hanging off every one of them, and they tore in and out of the houses to collect the bundles or deliver the bundles back.
And there'd be a mix, these laundries, would they, of doing commercial laundry for hotels or whatever, and domestic people's laundry as well?
No, I think you should see the whole thing as being domestic, because...
As being commercial or...
No, domestic, because the commercial side was really done in-house by the hotels themselves.
Right.
There wasn't any, what we would call today, linen hire companies or anything like that. And I'm talking about in Southern Ireland, of course.
Right.
It didn't exist at that time, in the 60s. They came around really when the laundrettes began to get in trouble in the 1970s. Yeah. Because they began to fade as well.
To sort of put you into this this picture then, what were you doing at the time in general before you got involved with this particular project?
I had become a specialist in the increase of sales of vans. Now that of course covered all kinds of areas, but as long as it was van sales, typically one started off with cakes. We had Hale Trent cakes in Bristol, and that moved from cakes into meat pies and sausages and things of that sort. But later, because they were in all kinds of difficulty in terms of keeping their turnover up, it became the laundries.
So the vans that you increased the sales of, they were what, rental vans on fleet to these companies, or? No,
they all owned their own at this time. One of my biggest clients at this time was a large company in Sunderland, and they do actually still exist as the directors of the Sunderland Football Club. But leaving that to one side, they were a typical conglomerate of that time, with all kinds of other factories associated with it, making aluminium furniture and things of that sort. But they had a very large van fleet, over 80 actually, in this particular laundry, which covered the whole of the northeast area. And so they did have their own things. This idea that you're hinting at, really, which is putting out things to other people, really didn't exist at that time.
Yeah.
In the 1960s, people had their own things, and they had their own vans and all the rest of it. In fact, one of the Dublin laundries, which I was associated with, their electrical floats were so slow, they reckoned that anybody walking up the hill could beat them. Yeah. They were returned to the laundry absolutely exhausted in their batteries, and they used to go roughly at half a mile an hour back into the laundry. it was a real joke for people trying to make their way up Kilmainham to do that.
And you increased the kind of the delivery business for these van fleets, as in the amount of work that they were able to do?
Well, the way that it was organised was that every van had a route, and you could measure the effectiveness of every van route, for instance in laundries, by bundle size and by the number of bundles which they collected. Now, typically in Southern Ireland, the situation was that bundle size was very small, although there was a great number of them.
Right.
And that was the way that you could measure them. And so all my schemes were based on increasing the number of bundles for a particular van route.
I get it. So from that then, which was based in England, was it typically, or were you already going over to Ireland at that point?
Well, there was a very interesting scheme that happened at that time that I think this was rather copycat really, but the Northern Irish government introduced a scheme where they could get 50% off for all consultancy work which was done in Northern Ireland. Well, it was only a matter of months later that the Southern Irish government did exactly the same thing.
Right, I get it.
And this was a big impetus for all of us involved in sales consultancy work, that we did begin to get not just laundry work, but other kinds of people. For instance, I had motor companies as well, which were typically Northern Irish, which was because they were much more developed than they were in Southern Ireland at that time. So those were the sort of people we got, and that did help very much to increase our sales of laundry business. And funnily enough, the only laundries that we got were in Southern Ireland, not in Northern.
Right.
And of course that brings me eventually to the story about the Magdalen.
So you were
laundries.
already doing laundries in the Republic of Ireland by the time you got. I mean, I'm going to assume it was a phone call, but I mean, I don't know how.
Yes, that's the way that it worked, because one became quite well known.
Right.
I had already done, or the company that I was involved in, we'd already done between us something like 20 laundries at that time, mostly, of course, in England, but we had done a couple in Dublin, very successfully, I might say, because our schemes were unknown for the people of Ireland, and they did go down very well indeed. Yeah. And so that there was already a third-party reference, if you like,
yeah.
In Southern Ireland of how effective we were
yeah.
for the laundries that were there.
I don't want to get too much at the moment into the kind of secrets of that, because I'm hoping we're going to do that on the way, because one of the things that with our podcast that we like to do is be useful and give people an idea of how the metas work, particularly within business. But because there's an important historical angle here as well, quite fascinating. Who was it who contacted you to do with the Magdalen Laundries, and how did that process begin?
Yes, well, it was. I got a phone call to my Birmingham offices, which is where we were sent at the time, saying that introducing himself to me as a laundry in Southern Ireland, and that he knew already that I'd had a very successful do in the Kilmainham laundry, which was one of the main Dublin laundries, and interestingly enough, a Protestant-run laundry,
yeah.
which becomes rather interesting later on. And he said that he'd met these particular people at a laundry convention, and they had sung my praises very highly, and particularly the way in which I'd increased their sales by a very large percentage indeed in a matter of a couple of years.
Yeah.
And so would I come and see him?
Right.
And actually on that basis, that he already knew of success which we had, I was more than happy to get on a plane from Elmdon Airport in Birmingham to Dublin, and then of course take the single track railway down to the southern tip of Ireland, where he explained to me what it was he wanted me to do.
Did you, obviously, just because it's the picture's in my head now of you arriving in Wexford, but did you have someone meet you at the station or anything like that? Or
No, it never seemed to work out that way.
Right.
I always seemed to have to make my own way to wherever the place was. The way that I normally did it was by arriving at the station, which is in the centre of Wexford, as it happens, and ask direction of just passers-by.
Yeah.
And people, particularly in Southern Ireland and that far south in Ireland, very, very friendly and very helpful, and seemed to have a most astonishing amount of time, which is something that was beginning to get in considerable shortage in England at that time.
Yeah.
But no, I made my way to the laundry. Typically, of course, what looked like a broken down building on a sort of outskirts of the centre, and just walked in and said who I was.
Yeah. And so when you went into there, he was running obviously a not Magdalen laundry, a different type of laundry. So what did he say to you when you went in?
Well, quite simply that he started off by saying that he knew that I was dealing with this company in Dublin, and that I'd had quite different sort of experiences there. But he told me about his own laundries, which actually included three. The main one in Wexford, a second one in Carlow, and a third one which was, as it were, out in the country. And I never went to that, so I can't say much about it really. But he told me about his setup there, and he said that he'd been given a special task to be done, and then he had to tell me that he was a papal knight.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't mean very much to me at that particular time.
Well, being a good Protestant boy.
A good Protestant. But he did show me that behind his door he had a very interesting chart. And what it did was to label a whole lot of charities which they supported from his laundry. And whenever one of the 70-odd people that came to him, he showed them this chart and said, if I give you money, it means they won't get any, they won't get any, they won't get any. So you can see that I'm afraid there isn't any room for me to add to this chart. And he said, this is the way that we operate all the way. And I've got a very delicate and difficult task, which I've called you to help me with, because I've been given this task by the papal legate. Well, again, that meant very little to me, but he'd been contacted directly by the Vatican as a papal knight to do this task.
I suppose we should kind of get into just what a papal knight is for those people who, including myself, who may not be too familiar with it. But as I understand it, there are a number of chivalric orders, distinctions that the Vatican can give. And they can give them for a number of reasons, but it seems to boil down to who they wish to keep within their influence, not necessarily in a negative way, but reward and keep within the influence, particularly of those people who are not clergy, are not priests, but are maybe business people or political people. And that kind of strange parallel power that any religious institution has, but particularly the Roman Catholic Church because of the extent of its influence, especially in the Republic of Ireland. And so he was, if you like, an anointed businessman by the Vatican to extend his influence. Is that something which is fair? Or?
Yes, there is a little bit of a complication here. The Vatican, as I've learned later, really, as a result of how this whole thing turned out, had great difficulty with its clergy. It didn't really want to involve them in change, and therefore if it had a problem within the church which it acknowledged as either a growing one or an evil that had um, begun to show itself. They would use the people who were confraternities, to use another word, a European word for similar sort of lay people, and particularly people who would have a speciality of sorting out a particular problem. And in this particular case, they'd gone to exactly the right man, who was already a member of one of these knights sorted out by the Vatican, and he was a laundry owner.
Yeah.
So they thought that he would know the right people to carry out the task which they had in mind.
I suppose, to put it in a simple fashion, I mean, just as the Queen knights people, I mean, the Pope knights people, doesn't he? Or the powers in the Vatican knight people, which bring them into an order which, you know, has an attending decorations that they wear, and, you know, official things, and all that sort of regalia and that goes with it.
The only thing that I knew at that time was that people bowed to this man in the street.
Oh, right.
As I went about Wexford with him, because he took me to a number of their shops, which they also had, and people bowed to him in the street.
Right.
So I knew that he had power which was recognised within Wexford, with him being a papal knight.
So that it's almost like, just as when you salute in the army, you salute the Queen's Commission. It's like them saluting the Vatican's authority through him as a vehicle or something like that.
Yeah, something like that. And
I had no idea that was...
No, well, in the same way, I was always astonished that the fact that people who had been given to me to help in the task which I had would stop and talk to the priests endlessly in the street, not taking any notice of the fact that we had appointments and all the rest of it. He would give all the time to the priests that they stopped in the street in the same way. And it was hard for me to understand how that kind of time use could be real.
So onto the task he gave you. So this is a task that he was being given as a papal knight by the Vatican.
That's right.
Possibly with oversight of the Pope, I don't know, or at least...
Well, the Curia.
Yes, indeed.
As I've learnt since.
Right, yes, indeed.
The powers that be in the Vatican had laid out through the papal legate the fact that they were very worried about what was going on in Southern Ireland. And I didn't know anything much about it. And he said to me, what I want you to do is quite simple. I want you to close every one of the nuns' laundries. Now, they never used the words which we know today, Magdalen Laundries, or anything like that. As far as he was concerned, they were the nuns' laundries.
Yeah.
And he said, I want every one of those to be starved of bundles to the extent that they are forced to close.
Yeah, through competition.
And that is exactly it. And I know that your scheme, if it's the same one as you used at Kilmainham, is going to starve them of bundles to the extent that they just can't keep going.
Yeah,
and I said, that's right, it will do that.
Now, the obvious question is, why would the church want to close its own charitable laundries? So the nub of it is, why had they become an embarrassment to the Catholic Church, being that they are church-run institutions?
Yes, at that time I had no idea of what was going on, other than the fact that I was told, as the thing progressed, that these awful nuns standing on boxes in the centre of the laundries, of which there were as many of them as the women that worked there, were extremely cruel, were asking the women to do jobs which normally in laundries were done with people either with gloves on their hands or carrying out some sort of security of their persons. They had no machinery, hardly at all. So they just used woman power for everything. And a lot of the people were young girls who'd been taken into the laundry more or less as slaves.
Yeah.
And I understood very, very simply that most of the women who were doing the work were slaves, and slaves under this appalling regime of these nuns who seemed to me, from what I learned, to be country girls themselves who had all the nastiness of women who were celibate.
Yes, yes.
And I mean, that's all I knew at that time.
Yeah.
And I knew how horrible celibate women could be.
Yeah, and as we know, some celibate men as all. I mean, celibacy
Absolutely.
has some pretty negative consequences
Has
en masse, does it not?
Absolutely.
Especially if perhaps the people who are having enforced celibacy because of their role aren't naturally celibate people, what you might say,
That's
which
right.
I'm sure do exist. Back to the idea of why the church decided to act through its papal night rather than directly impose closure on the laundries, which of course it could have done, couldn't it?
Yes, it could.
So why do you, I mean, I know this may be sort of beyond all the facts that you had at the time, but why do you think they took that route rather than directly imposing?
This is back to what I said earlier about the problems with the clergy.
Right.
It's almost as if the Roman Church, in its sheer size, and after all it's a very big organisation, ran two streams of religious life. The clergy have their own structures and all the rest of it, which were very slow-moving, very negative, and also wanting the status quo in everything that existed.
Yeah.
And a very well organised group of people. But whenever they wanted to bring about change, they always had to go outside their clergy side and move it through their lay people. So that's why I understood that they would do it through. And after all, amongst the lay people were the specialists.
Yeah.
Rather than the clergy who were just, well, in many cases in Southern Ireland, they were farmers' boys themselves.
Yeah, of course.
Although they perhaps had good training at Maynooth or somewhere else like that.
Is there also an indication, knowing what we know now, and this is just a thought that's occurred to me, that if they had directly imposed closure, there would have been more investigations into what was going on in there? As in, it would have raised the profile of, rather than just allowing them to sort of die through competition, thinking of themselves as an organisation wanting to protect their own reputation. If they'd almost like admitting that something was going on, if they'd imposed closure on them, is there any, do you think, weight in that?
Yes, I do. I think it also raises one rather other interesting point. I got the impression from talking to the gentleman who was Papal Knight that they were worried about the number and type of nuns they had. Now, so this was a case of when you close one of these places, you're doing two things. You're getting rid of the evil that is being perpetrated, but you're also putting the nuns out of business.
Yeah.
Now, there's no doubt that the number of nuns in Southern Ireland, as indeed the number of clergy generally, and other orders of monks and Jesuits and all the rest of the thing, had gone exponentially large, to the point that the Roman Church was very worried about its number of adherents of that sort. And I thought very definitely that part of my job was to get rid of nuns,
Right.
as well as getting rid of the laundry.
Yeah.
So that, I think, adds into the thinking that was being taken place within the Vatican. They wanted to get rid of the evil, but they wanted to solve the problem of far too many nuns at the same time, and nuns not doing useful work.
Right, so they're not, the practical business of running this global organisation, you need to have money coming in, don't you?
Yes.
And so in some ways, nuns are almost dependent upon that, and because they don't produce stuff themselves. Some do, of course, But if you have a large amount of those people who are pulling on the system without giving into it, I mean, I'm thinking about particularly religious orders that are productive, and I immediately think of the Trappists making all that beer in Belgium, to incredible profit which they put into charity and everything. But I mean, that they are productive monks, those guys, aren't they? But obviously not everybody in a religious order is.
Well, in Southern Ireland, they reckoned that something like 80% of the organisations within the Catholic Church were non-productive.
Yeah.
Which is a very large pull on what was a fairly poor society at this time. I mean, I had previous knowledge of how good they could be because Mitchelstown Cooperative, which was a big pig farming operation in Southern Ireland, were very much involved with a client of mine in Belfast for meat products and so on. So I knew that they'd got very good businesses, but they were being pulled upon by this vast weight of nuns, priests and all kinds of clergy in various kinds of organisations. And the number of Franciscans was enormous.
Right.
That just typically. And so this was really a case of the, as I understood it at that time, of the Vatican really trying to gain control back in Ireland, quite apart from the fact that very considerable evil was being perpetrated in those laundries. And because they were defunct organisations without proper control, I mean, typically, for instance, in some order of nuns, a person would be having to be in obeisance to the abbess one morning, and the next morning she'd find she was the abbess.
Yes.
I mean, this is the sort of madness that went on in these places.
And under that kind of chaos, I mean, in the 1990s, they found a mass grave in some of the land that the nuns had sold off, which turned out to have 155 people in. Now, I mean, that is astonishing that certain things were able to go on to the extent where you've got a mass grave of that number of people, which nobody knew the existence of.
That's right.
And of course, you couldn't possibly have known that it was to that extent at the time. So in terms of your method then, and the scheme that you had, could you tell us a little bit about how that worked?
Well, it was actually extremely simple, because the one very interesting thing about van sales is that it is essentially a simple sales operation. But because it is being done by people, they can be motivated. Now, at that time, my partner and myself had organised with some, funnily enough, an Irish company who were operating in London, a catalogue scheme where it was possible for the van salesmen individually to gain enough points so that they could spend them, as it were, freely in this catalogue. And the catalogues were beautifully done.
Yeah.
And absolutely, I mean, the sort of thing that the idea was that they took them home and discussed it with their wives, you see.
Yeah.
And so if you got a man motivated, not just by the points, but by his wife as well,
Right.
It's going to really be a very strong thing.
So the bonuses, if you like, were paid in points, which they could redeem with the goods in this amazing catalogue.
Indeed, and they all had catalogues, and they knew it was very easy for me to explain this. And I started the whole thing off with meetings, which were plenty of beer and cakes and that sort of thing, and which were usually something a bit hard to contain, particularly in Ireland, as you can imagine, because the drinking was amazing. But it was surprising how, for a person who looked very English indeed, I was able to penetrate through to these people because of the sheer power of this point-based system and the goodness of the catalogue. I always had them start off by looking at the catalogue,
Yeah,
and they were amazed.
What kind of things were in the catalogue to...
Well, imagine Amazon writ large in
Right.
today's terms,
Okay.
and beautifully illustrated, far better quality than the sort of thing that you see in Argos catalogues or
Yeah.
anything like that
Yeah.
today. And I mean, it's something to drool over.
And they were sort of what, household goods
They were altogether household goods.
and toys and things like that is what
Yes,
I'm imagining.
absolutely.
Because it would have to be something which would interest the whole domestic
The whole
environment.
That's right.
So that people could see the benefit for the family, as it were, if everyone was going to get involved. And I can imagine with the toys being on there, children sort of pestering
Exactly.
father
Everybody interested. Yes.
Yeah.
And remember too that at that time van salesmen were not paid a very great deal of money.
Yeah,
And so these things that came by way of perks of that sort were very strong motivationally. I mean, typically, a van salesman would be making £20 a week, whereas when I was in Sunderland offering these sort of jobs to people in the Sunderland laundry, the riveters, who mostly had had to sack because shipbuilding had gone in the Tyne, were making £80 a week.
yeah,
And they couldn't take that kind of a drop.
yes,
I mean, you could understand. I mean, the sheer horror of having to go down to £20 from 80 is too much for any man with any kind of dignity
yeah,
to bear.
yeah. Just to put it in a sort of context of the 60s, because I've got to say that when I hear sort of £80 a week, it doesn't really mean a lot to me, who wasn't alive during the 60s, because I can't really envisage what that was. But was that a lot of money?
That was a very great deal of money. The only people who made that kind of money were hod carriers. These are the
Right.
people who carried
Yeah,
bricks
yeah.
up on the building sites.
So did they make more than bricklayers, the hod carriers?
Oh, very much more.
Did they? Yeah,
And
yeah,
it was down to physical strength.
yeah,
I mean, by the time you were 45, you'd had it.
yeah,
You couldn't do the hods anymore. But up until that time, just as later on it was the plasterers
yeah.
who made big...
In the 80s,
Yes.
when we think of the
Yes,
house
that's
building.
right. But that was a good deal of money, whereas the average wage was much closer to the £20 a week that
Yeah.
the van salesman.
Is there an equivalent, while we're talking about occupations? When I went to the brilliant glass museum in St Helens, they explained how if you were the glass blower, you were like the sort of David Beckham of St Helens. And I remember our mutual friend Betty saying that all of the mothers wanted their daughters to marry a glass blower because of the status that they had in the town and because of the money that they made as the skilled worker, which was very large.
Yes.
There seems to be an interesting parallel that there are certain jobs in manufacturing or in creating things that did, like riveting, that did make a great deal of money.
Well, you have that extrapolated in all kinds of ways. We always used to think of the girls in Nottingham being the best looking girls in Britain.
Yeah.
Well, it was quite simply because they worked in boots.
Yeah, of
And
course.
they made
yeah.
more money
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
doing their pharmaceutical things than anything else.
And of course they had access to the cosmetics.
They had absolutely.
Right.
And I mean, they did look fantastic. I used to go dancing in Nottingham. I know how good they looked.
And of course, now I'm thinking about it, tuition on how to do the presentation as well, presumably.
Yes, exactly.
So all those things together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you got the same sort of thing wherever there was, like St Helens, a specialist manufacturer, where in something that was a premium, like glass blowing, which carried on usually through family lines,
Yeah.
like the docks were in Liverpool, for example.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And to be the way there was to go through your father,
Yeah.
and his father had probably done the same thing through what was your grandfather.
Back to the scheme of
Yes.
for the laundry. So was then that next stage that you had this opening meeting with his laundry people, and you roll out what is the incentive scheme, if you like, and then where do we take it from there in implementation?
The implementation is something that was very important to me because it's the sort of thing in, say, local government is so weak at the present time. This is a hobby horse of mine, if you like. But in their budgeting, they never seem to put money aside for maintenance or the execution of a thing.
Yeah.
They put the money ahead to buy equipment and to set up a scheme, but then let's supposedly goes into the ether
Right.
and is run by itself. But typically, I always had to have a dedicated executive within a company who would be my man or woman in the case of some of the laundries, and they would make sure that my scheme kept going day by day, hour by hour, every time. And that was doubly done down in Wexford because it was quite simply something of great importance. And there's no doubt that the guy in charge was very motivated to get it done. So he let me have a young man who he was mentoring for my number two, as it were, within the company.
It was like your right hand.
That's right.
Yeah.
In fact, I never ever hardly saw the Papal Knight after I started.
Yeah.
It was this young man who actually was very good indeed. In fact, I can't think of anywhere where I had anybody as good.
Yeah.
He was really excellent. And he came to me 1 week after it started and says, "You know what these buggers are doing?" I said, "No, they're persuading their customers to divide their bundles in two, so it looks like a new customer." And for one of the half, I said, I couldn't care less.
Yeah, because that shows their desire.
Their desire is there. I said, chastise it verbally, but do nothing about it.
Yeah.
And he says, I said, no, that's the way to do it, because the main thing is that they are very motivated to do it.
Yeah.
And as I saw the weekly sales sheets come in, I knew it was working, because these guys were adding something like 20 or 30 customers a week each, which was a huge amount at that time. And bearing in mind that it went on for 2 years before it came to a natural end, as it were, and I started at their sister laundry in Carlow, the thing was very, very well motivated indeed. Indeed, I had very good sales results there, indeed.
Now, other than the implementation of the scheme, I imagine that you also did other things, as in to support it, like in terms of your general consultancy work. So, I mean, did you go into laundry and do a sort of consultant's report in there as well?
Not really. The only time that we got involved at all was when I laid off to some of my colleagues who were also consultants in production work.
Yeah.
I had a case in Belfast, in Telfair Street, where I used one of my colleagues to do a production job there, but that was very rare.
The kind of, I don't know if this is a legitimate concern or not, but the kind of thing that made me think of was, how do you know that when you put the incentive scheme in, that there aren't other areas of the business that are compromised, so you won't see the sales results that you want to see? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, and that used to happen quite often, where you would, we used to call it breaking the bank. What you're doing really is that the sales would take off at such a speed that production couldn't cope with it.
Yeah.
Well, that was of concern, and I took that as part of my responsibility to make sure that the production could always cope with the sales increase.
Yeah.
Now, I had a perfect reason to go to the directors of the company and say, this isn't good enough. You're wasting your money on me because you're not able to comply. Now, that did happen very rarely in the laundries, because laundries have the most amazing capacity just by working a few extra hours. But where you had, for instance, I did Scripto Ball Pen, which was another one of them early on, and Ever Ready Razor, you have got industrial processes which require light-footedness on behalf of the production side. And I was very much concerned always that they kept pace with the sales increase that went on. And usually the management managed to sort it out themselves.
Yeah.
But where they couldn't, I was able to suggest things to them or have a colleague who would step in to help them.
And presumably in planning terms, when you went in, you not assumed, but you were well aware that you were probably going to be successful. And you probably had more confidence in the scheme working than anybody else because you'd seen it.
Yes.
You'd seen it. It wasn't like it was theory. So you would be in a position right away to suggest that they needed to get their production scheme to their production methods up to a point where they could take into account extra sales.
This is the sort of thing that I would find in my 3-day survey right at the very beginning. For example, in this ball pen company I'm talking to you about, very well known in its time, headquarters in Atlanta in America, I found out that 2 women who were employed there had been producing exactly the same sales figures for 20 years as 2 other women. In other words, 2 of the women were completely and utterly wasting their time.
Doing the same job.
Yeah, doing the same job. I mean, that's just typical of what a survey finds out.
Yeah.
And that shows you the depth to which you have to penetrate on a survey in order to really see the company for what it is. There were, even though that company had been going for a little while, management don't see when their concerns for improvement can have bad effects.
Yeah.
And typically, the fact somebody wanted sales figures, let's have some women in to do it. Well, he didn't know that he got women who were already doing it.
Yeah.
It's typical of it.
Yeah, and that reminds me of a story that somebody I know who works for one of the big consultant companies told me, is that they did a project with a hospital, and they uncovered a piece of equipment looking through the inventory that was worth £500,000, and it had been bought at very short notice on the authority of a doctor, as a kind of, I suppose what we would call in the army an urgent operational requirement. So he said, we need this right now. And they questioned the fact that this piece of equipment was there and said, look, this has been bought at short notice. It's £500,000. And they said, well, our medical professionals should have the authority to be able to do that at short notice if it has a medical need. And he said, yes, but you've already got one in storage in the hospital. Now that's £500,000 of taxpayers' money duplicated because of that exact same thing, that they didn't know what they already have. And because they had a medical professional screaming for the equipment, they then just got and bought another one, not knowing that they had it.
Yes, in looking back over 100 assignments which I had, I've got to say that there were many occasions when I found redundant machinery.
Right.
And in fact, I got several companies out of deep financial problems merely by selling off redundant machinery and stuff. And indeed, one of the best things I did in these companies was say, you have no more money at all unless you can sell something.
Yeah.
And it's astonishing how effective that can be in making everybody alive to the fact that what they're dealing with is assets. And but all assets have to work.
Yeah.
I mean, typically in engineering company, you get masses and masses of old exhibition materials hanging around the place, which are doing nothing but taking space.
Yeah.
Now, nobody has got the authority to throw away old exhibition stuff.
Yes.
Typically, nobody has been given that responsibility.
So nobody does because...
No. So when a consultant comes in and say, right, clear that lot out, you know, I've just been taken on, and now the broken down lorries can arrive in large numbers at the back and take all this lot away. And what they've got is another third of the factory they didn't even know they got.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, typically.
Yeah.
But that occurs with people who become unnecessary as well as it goes through.
Yeah.
And this is right back to the Roman Church that we're talking about.
I mean, that all assets have to work.
Yes.
That almost sounds like a kind of rule of business success.
It is. Otherwise, it is dead stuff is really awful.
Yeah.
It has a bad effect on everybody.
Like almost poisonous.
It is almost like a fungal growth.
Yeah, yeah.
It is. And whether it's occurring around the petrol tanks around the back of a building, or whether it's occurring in the places where lorries get loaded, or whether it's taking place to one side in the production area, those things fester and cause the most awful things. In fact, I'm recalling now a factory where the moment I got the stuff out, I immediately had the whole factory painted white inside. Because the one thing people can't stand is the fact that having seen all this stuff gone, they don't see an immediate replacement for it. And there's nothing like building work to build the confidence of workers within a factory.
Yeah, like, oh, we must be doing well because someone's building a wall behind the factory.
Or painting it.
Yeah.
They wouldn't do that if they hadn't got money, would they?
And so that's an important psychological effect then of motivation, of confidence in the business.
Exactly right.
Yeah. On back to the festering nuns, if we may. So we've got this point, let's say, where you've implemented the incentive scheme with the catalogue, and you've been running that for a number of years, and then you go to the other laundry within the Papal Knights thing, and then you do the same thing there.
Absolutely the same, because they had a similar situation.
Yeah.
Although not exactly the same, obviously. But there is one thing that's missing out of this slightly, and you could have asked me, for instance, when did I first know that we were having a good effect?
I should have asked that question.
You know, of diminishing the what's become known as the Magdalen Laundries. Yeah. Well, I got to know very quickly, and I'll tell you why. Because although the nuns were there festering in these places, a lot of the girls had contacts outside, and we knew that there's no work. All the place is gone dead, and all these things were coming back to me very, very quickly indeed.
What do you mean, within a matter of months rather than...
Within the matter of weeks.
Really?
Yes. The effect of what we were working was coming back quickly, because the way in which those nunnery laundries worked was very fragile. I mean, they were doing work which was hardly necessary in many cases. They were highly inefficient.
Yeah.
And there was far, far too many people as managers, who were all nuns, of course, compared to the girls. And so any effect on the turnover was immediately felt. Mm-hmm. And I picked up through this gentleman who was my right-hand man. He was absolutely amazed. He said to me with his eyes wide open, he says, "I can't believe how quick it's working. They're moaning like hell," he says to me. Yeah. Well, that happened, and I mean that was a constant refrain throughout the whole of the 2 years, that these places were really feeling it in terms of getting, and it wasn't long. The first one went and closed within a year, which is very, very quick in laundry terms for a place to disappear that fast.
What was the length of your involvement? So you had a couple of years, and then the Carlo and...
Yes, because I was with them 4 years altogether.
4 years, yeah.
But I mean, it went on.
So do you have any idea of how many closed in that period and subsequent periods as a direct result?
No.
Yeah. It'd be hard to know, wouldn't it?
It would. Just that it was a highly effective effort that I did there. I was well praised for it, well paid for it, and it did become a very good third-party reference for me.
Of course.
When I wanted other people to know, I said, well, just get in touch with the people at Wexford.
Did you see the papal knight again kind of towards the end?
Hardly at all.
But you didn't see him towards the end, like he didn't sort of say, or did he
No,
write to you or say, well done, Ian?
In any case, I was dealing with his ex-nun sister,
Right.
who was in charge of the laundries in Carlo by that time.
Of course, yeah.
And she'd become the person who was there. He also had other relatives there of a rather more dubious kind. And this is where I came across something particularly Irish, is the way they look after families.
Yes.
They had a so-called manager in that laundry in Carlo, who I said, he's absolutely useless. And she said, I'm afraid he's one of ours.
Right.
That was it. In other words, he's a member of the family.
This is what you got.
And that's what it is. And I had to accept that fact.
Yes.
And the fact, actually, he was part of a rugby playing dynasty, which is also very holy in Ireland at that time.
Yeah.
Almost as holy as the Roman Church was.
Right. And of course the Gaelic football, which you,
yes.
I know was it another occasion you encountered the Gaelic football?
And I got it through the women's side, which was called Commodie.
Of shinty, isn't it? It's a form of shinty or hurling.
Yes.
Yeah, I see, yeah.
Yes, well, I came across that in Northern Ireland first, and what a rough game.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
I mean, madness.
So bringing this sort of together, when you got some distance, like you have now, obviously in time on that episode, can you see it? Do you think in a kind of as part of how certain things in the Catholic Church and society wider started to improve a little on things like those state-run institutions?
Yes, indeed. But of course, there was something else in the background which has only come out since, and that was, of course, the abuse of minors.
Yes.
Which, I mean, only this week there has been a cardinal in America has been dismissed.
Yeah.
Which is astonishing that a person be dismissed.
Oh yeah.
By the Catholic Church. I mean, normally speaking, they've been asked to resign. Well, he officially has resigned, but the truth is that he's been dismissed. And once a cardinal goes, he goes to nothing.
Yeah.
You know, absolutely, from being a top notch right down to nothing at all. And this was always a background. I have realised since. They had also known about the abuse of minors in the church, quite apart from the problem with the nuns and all the rest of it, and that they were fighting that. It was part of their motivation to clean up the situation.
And that was there in the 60s.
That's right, well before that even.
Right, and we're talking about 2018 now.
Yes. And
they knew that, you would say, nearly 60 years ago.
That's right. Well, you see, they also made a mistake, I understand, in the Vatican since. They tried to do it through the clergy way. And that was the mistake. Where they had success was when they went through the papal knights.
Yes.
And therefore, whatever their problems, and including the problem that they've had with the problem with minors being assaulted and so on since, has only been brought about not by clergy, but by the laymen in the convocations and papal knights and orders that way. So, yes, it was part of I realised that I played my part in a cleaning up operation that was beginning. And of course it hasn't yet completed.
No, of course.
It's still masses of it, still going on.
Yeah.
But not anywhere like it used to be.
Yeah.
So the clean-up operation is working, but typically in a church which after all has been going for nearly 2,000 years with its own manufactured theology and all the rest of the thing, they don't move quickly.
Yeah.
And this is what stopped the clergy operating it for 50 years, even though it had been known about. And it was only when there was a change in the Vatican that the more enlightened popes, once they got past the Second World War, where you had some collusion between the Roman Church and fascism, for example, you got a change where they would really use the papal orders for what they were worth and the specialists that were there. And so you're seeing the clean-up operation not any longer dependent on clergy as the way of doing it, but dependent on their lay orders, of which there are many.
Indeed.
Many indeed.
Yeah.
And even ones that are so odd that they spread even outside the Roman Church, which is Opus Dei,
Yeah. Yeah.
for example, which is a maverick organisation, if there ever was one, but typical of the sheer number of organisations sanctioned by the Vatican as being important from a spiritual point of view.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Ian. I hope that sheds some light on what is probably something that's not understood well enough about even our recent history and, of course, your lifetime. So thank you very much indeed for that. I hope that's been very useful to people.
It's a pleasure indeed.
Thank you. If you find these videos useful, please like, subscribe and click the bell, and we'll keep the content coming. And you may want to check out my book, Awakening the Warrior, available on Amazon.